Hi, welcome to another episode of Swarajya Standpoint. Something very interesting and scary is happening in China. But before I come to that, I have a very short story to tell you all. Back in 2008, just before the Lehman crisis was about to unfold, and this was around July, August of 2008, the Lehman crisis happened in September, rather on September 15 to be precise. So, this one call happened between the former chairman of Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, a very, very prominent name in the financial history of the United States, and the Secretary of the US Treasury, Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson, as many of you would know, was a former Goldman Sachs. So Hank Paulson calls up Greenspan for some sort of advice. Of course, he says, "We have a problem. Somehow there are too many houses in the pipeline. There's a surplus of supply of houses, and that is pulling the houses prices down. So what do we do? It's a very fairly simple problem. Too many houses, the demand is not keeping up with the supply. The problem is the prices are falling down. So Paulson looks to Greenspan for a solution. Now, Greenspan, probably in good humor, probably as a rhetorical answer, says, "Why doesn't the government buy out all the houses and burn them down? Just burn the extra houses and you'll have the prices stabilized." Now, that was one of the jokes that come out from the 2008 crisis early on. Of course, the US did not buy the houses, though they attempted to. At one point, that was also an idea under consideration, but the US did not. Lehman crashed. But 13 years later, today, China is doing exactly what Greenspan asked Paulson to do as a joke. Just a month ago, 15 high skyscrapers in China were, were demolished. They were actually bombed using 85,000 blasting points, a controlled demolition, because they had no buyers. The property was conflicted because of some legal issues, as it happens in India also, but they took it down. Now, of course, they are not trying to stabilize the price of houses by doing that, but China today is at that point where they're not averse to the idea of having controlled demolition for surplus properties. That is what's happening in China, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the first aspect is of what's real estate amounting to China's economy. Is it like India? Is it like America? Not really. There's a difference. Now, if you look at China, the one remarkable feat they have had after their independence, after the 1949 Civil War, not the independence, was that they've rather pulled out a lot of people from poverty. And this happened especially after the 1990s. A lot of people have been pulled out of poverty. Now, they pulled people out of poverty, so they assumed that people would be moving to the cities, they would require apartments, they would invest in urban dwellings, so they decided to build. And this started the great building spree of China. Between 2008 and 2011, there were 3 years in between when the total concrete that was used in China was more than the concrete used by the United States in the last 100 years. That is how massive the building spree was. Another example, between 2008 to 2018, the Chinese constructed a high speed rail network, an HSR as they call it, which was greater than the entire world combined. They started in 2008 from zero, from the scratch, and they went on to build in the next 10 years the greatest high speed rail network the world has ever seen, and greater than the entire high speed rail network of the entire world put together. Now, this idea was also replicated in the residential real estate industry. Build, build, and keep building. The Go cities came up. The Chinese assumed that the prices of the houses would always go up, as they assumed in the United States, as they've always assumed in India. The prices did go up. But what happened in China was that the wages could not keep up with the growing housing prices. So, beyond the point, there was no demand for houses and prices started falling. The prices started falling. The developers who had taken loans from state banks, from state backed institutions, as many are there in China, they started defaulting. And this created, in the last 3, 4 years, a sort of a debt crisis in China, as Xi Jinping started to address one in 2017. And this is what gave us the company which is at the heart of the real estate crisis in China right now, Evergrande. Now, the Chinese economy and the real estate are very, very closely linked. You cannot say real estate is just one of the enablers of the economy in China. That's not how it works. In China, the real estate and the sectors dependent on real estate, say your construction activities, your steel, your aluminium, coal, plastic, glass, all these industries which are instrumental in construction are also dependent on the growth of real estate. So, what happened essentially was because there was such a massive boom in building physical infrastructure, the copper industry was getting a lot of money, the aluminium industry was getting a lot of money, the steel industry was getting a lot of money. So, there was a trickle down effect that was going on. Now, suddenly, because of this real estate crisis, the other industries are also in a limbo as to how do they sustain that growth. And truth be told, more than one fourth of the Chinese GDP, one fourth of the Chinese GDP growth, they all come from real estate, almost 29%. So this is the point of contention for China today, that how do we contain the damage to our real estate sector because it's so critical to our economy. And already before the COVID pandemic hit China, they were battling with a slow economic growth. While one argument can be made that by the virtue of the size of economy of China, a 4 to 5% growth is a great idea. But even then, they need to sustain that growth. The next aspect is, are there parallels between Evergrande and Lehman in America? Is China having its Lehman moment? A lot of analysts, observers, stakeholders, they all have written that, oh, this is China's Lehman moment. China is going to crash. This is the end of real estate boom in China. That's not how it really works. There are a lot of differences, and we'll address them one by one. But let's talk about the parallels between 2008, the housing crisis in the US, which led to the Great Recession, and China. So, what happened in the United States? Suddenly, investment banks on the Wall Street discovered that what if you package the mortgages into investment products and sell it to investors? So, for that, they needed more mortgages, which enabled them to give out more home loans very cheaply. At one point, they were literally giving away loans to immigrants without checking any eligibility criteria. So, over there, beyond the point, you had citizens, normal routine people like you and me defaulting on their home loans because they thought if the bank thinks I'm in a position to pay back a loan, I must be, but they were not. So what happens? They start defaulting. The mortgage backed securities become nothing. They absolutely lose their value. And thus the investors lose their value. And thus the banks holding these mortgage backed securities lose their value. This is what happened in the United States. And the assumption was based on one simple factor: people will always pay back their home EMIs, they will never default on them, and the house prices will go up. But because people did not pay their home EMIs, they started selling off those houses. A lot, many of them did. The prices came crashing down. Now, what happened in China? In China, instead of citizens, it was the developers who went on a building spree. Now, a lot of these developers were in good books with the CCP. This is one subject of my analysis, which is coming up on Swarajya. So I would request you to keep following us over there. So there's one aspect which was very interesting in China was that a lot of these developers, real estate developers, were in cahoots with the CCP, not at the Beijing level, not just with Xi Jinping or the top leaders in China, but even at the provincial level. So what happened? This enabled them to get loans. This enabled them to get all the funds they would want to pump into their development, which they did. Now, beyond the point, as we discussed earlier, people couldn't afford the flats. They started defaulting. They were building and building, hoping that one day people will come to buy these apartments. And in the end, you had ghost cities. So in America, you had mortgage backed securities losing all their value. Lehman almost trading at $1 before it eventually crashed. In China, you had these developers who had taken far more loans than they could actually pay back. So this is the parallel. But then the question arises, is this indeed China's Lehman moment? Will Evergrande go the Lehman way? That is the interesting part. Now, China is not United States of America. That's one very important aspect to understand. Because every time there is an economic crash, there is a political aspect to it also. When 2008 happened, the US Treasury Secretary went to the Congress, literally begged them for a stimulus. And that was just before the election. So the Republicans also and the Democrats also did not have enough incentive to give him that stimulus, though they eventually did. In China, you have no sort of those problems. Over there, the CCP works very, very differently. Now, two things have happened. Of course, the CCP official spokesperson has already said that whatever fallout of Evergrande happens, if the Evergrande group really crashes, we can contain the fallout. Interestingly, that's what they said about Lehman also. But China thinks that they can contain the fallout out of Evergrande. That's what they think. And even if they can't, even with more than $330 billion in liabilities, in debt at this point, Evergrande would be in a position to sell off all its assets because they are the biggest real estate company in China, and thus be in a position where they're nationalized in a way, where CCP takes over all the assets. So, yes, in a way, they might actually crash, but then they would be rescued by the CCP in some other way, something that was not offered to Lehman. Now, the last question is, what is the future of Evergrande? The one aspect is that, yes, it could be nationalized, the assets could be taken over by the CCP, and there are hints that it's already happening. A month ago, Evergrande was supposed to pay an interest on the bonds, on the dollar dominated bonds it had issued. It missed that payment, which is a big deal, mind you. If any company is missing interest payments on its bonds, it's a very, very big deal. What followed that missing payment date was a month long grace period. So even when they missed that date in September, they had a month long grace period where they were supposed to make the payment. Just 2 days before that grace period expired, and just around that time, Evergrande transferred $83.5 million to Citibank, the payment they owed. Had they not made that payment, they would have been classified as a defaulter, sending stock markets around the world in a jiffy, in a limbo. They would have created sort of chaos. It would have sort of sent that panic button rush across the world markets, but that didn't happen. Just a couple of days, another news came by that Evergrande had resumed construction in some of its properties in South China. So there are indicators that the CCP has already stepped in. But the challenges remain. The Evergrande crisis has not been solved. There are $2 billion worth of interest payments lined up for next year, $7 billion worth of payments over the course of next 3-4 years. So, how is Evergrande supposed to do that? Unless they improve their cash flow automatically, they are not going to be able to. But that is where the CCP's blessings would be instrumental. And for the CCP, while Xi Jinping is on a spree to regulate real estate, he wants the apartment prices to come down. There would also be an incentive to save Evergrande or rather contain its fallout because in the future also the Chinese would be looking for overseas investors to raise money, to raise cash. And that is why Evergrande would not go the Lehman way. So the final question is this China's Lehman moment? No, it's not. China has had many of these Lehman moments since they've started tackling their debt crisis, but this will also pass. The CCP are very well equipped to handle the Evergrande crisis, and this will not be China's Lehman moment. Thank you for watching.